I'm delighted to welcome you to this event to mark the publication of Misagh Parsa's new book, Democracy in Iran, Why It Failed and How It Might Succeed. Misagh, of course, is a distinguished member of the Dartmouth Sociology Department and has been here since 1989. He is a fixture on campus, and I'm glad to say a regular participant in Takeyh events, so I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to celebrate his new book. This is your third book, correct? Yes. He's also written States, Ideologies, and Social Revolutions, a comparative analysis of Iran, Nicaragua, and the Philippines, and also Social Origins of the Iranian Revolution. Now, I'm of the school that believes that the publication of pretty much any serious book should be celebrated. Until you've written one, it's really hard to imagine the amount of work that goes into one of these. They're a little like children, and from what I understand from talking to Misagh, this one has been in preparation for the same amount of years as the average child, at least before it goes off to college. I've been trying to write an easy book for about 20 years, and I still haven't figured out how to do one. So I can't, underscore enough how much I think this is just a great accomplishment to do a major scholarly work like this. And I really want to congratulate you, Misagh, on that. I also want to begin by telling an anecdote of how we came to have this event, because I'm quite sure that had we left it to Misagh, who seems not to have a boastful bone in his body, I don't think we would have ever even known that there was a book coming out. I was at Logan Airport some months ago, and I ran into a friend and former colleague from Washington, someone I hadn't seen for 5 or 6 years, and he is a distinguished scholar of Iran, and it's actually someone I've even written articles with, and I looked at him, and I was delighted to see him, and he looked at me, and he said, "I'm still mad at you." And I found that quite a strange greeting after 5 or 6 years. And I asked why, and just to give you a little backstory, this is someone who came from the think tank world, had been tapped to be the special assistant to let's just say, a very great man who had gone into the Obama administration, and he was not, my friend was not a natural government type, and very soon this great man started not even circulating his memos, his own memos, to his special assistant. And then he left for the White House, leaving the special assistant behind, and this poor guy was isolated in an office not far from the State Department cafeteria for 3 or 4 months, wondering what he would do next. And padding around the first floor of the State Department in his socks. And I said to a friend, it turns out, who I did not expect to rat me out, that I thought that this friend was wholly unsuited for bureaucratic life. And apparently that had gotten back to him, and he was still mad at me about it 6 years later. Well, I apologized. I didn't get any kind of acknowledgement of that, but he looked at me, and the next thing he said was, "This colleague of yours, Misagh Parsa, has written a masterpiece." And I was completely taken aback, as I was by the first remark. And he said, it's the real deal. And he continued to praise it in terms that I had seldom heard, certainly from him and from anyone else in the scholarly world. And it turned out that he was reviewing the book and had a pre-publication copy. Now, I knew that something had been going on with Misagh because when I got here in 2013, Misagh was very dapper and well-kempt, and he looked like he was the owner of maybe a small European bank who vacationed on Capri. And over the time, he had developed more of, I would say, an Old Testament cast, if you will. And I knew that something was going on, but I wasn't quite sure what. And so I said, Misagh, I understand that you have a book coming out, and he acknowledged almost ruefully that yes, it was going to come out soon from Harvard University Press. And I said, well, I understand from this friend of mine in Washington that it's a masterpiece, and we want to do book events for all scholars at Dartmouth, particularly those who are doing work on international affairs. And Misagh sort of allowed grudgingly that, okay, he would let us do that if we wanted to. Well, I bought the book myself and started to read it. And I also saw that my angry friend was right, that it was beautifully written, that in the words of the Times Literary Supplement reviewer, that it was brilliantly argued, among other superlatives that that reviewer gave it. Richly detailed, informative, and engaged with really big ideas. And for those who despair of scholarly books that engage with ever smaller problems, let me tell you, here is your antidote. It seeks to explain why democracy failed to develop from the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when most of those who took part in that revolution and who were its most active proponents advocated the establishment of a real democracy. And relatedly, it asks the question, how will the Islamic Republic get from where it is today to a democratic future? And I won't steal any of the thunder on Misagh's thinking on that big issue. But let me just read one paragraph from my friend's review, which appeared in Survival, which is really sort of the British Foreign Affairs. And it begins by saying, Misagh Parsa's account of Iran is one of the most important books published about the Islamic Republic since its inception. Parsa's mastery of an impressive range of sources, his elegant writing style, and his intellectual honesty set his account apart from the legion of other books published on the theocratic state. His conclusions are as stark as they are important. The Islamic Republic cannot reform itself, and its path to genuine democratization can only come through an actual revolution. Well, we're meeting at a pretty exciting time in the history of the Islamic Republic. I think very few people really expected as good an outcome, positive an outcome, I think, from the West perspective, as the re-election of President Rouhani. Iran remains an incredibly difficult state for American policymakers. We'll talk about that a little bit later, and we'll talk about the election more with Professor Jean Garthwaite, who is here as well. But Misagh had a very good clip that I think demonstrates just how things might be changing and some of the hopes that certainly the people of Iran have. So I'll play that, and he'll explain it. Why don't you explain to us why that's an important question?
Well, there are a lot of these videos you can see in YouTube. The reason I picked this one was that this is from Mashhad, a very religious city, one of the, after Rome, is the second major. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Not at all? Okay. So it's a religious center. After Rome, it's the second major religious center in Iran. And the thing that happened after the 2009 Green Movement, the city basically is ruled by an Ayatollah whose name is Alam al-Huda, and he's representative of the supreme leader, that's Khamenei, and he decided to impose a ban on having concerts in the city. So this is the first concert after 2009 that people just organized in the streets. The other thing about this city is that Ayatollah Alam al-Huda's son-in-law, Raisi, was the guy who was running against the more liberal guy, and he's the guy who lost. And the third thing about this video is that you see some of the women who took the scarf and they were dancing. And so that's what you see more in cities like Tehran, but even in Mashhad, you see things like this that happen. Okay, the last time I spoke here in this room was right around Gene and I were here after the Green Movement. I think Dale was here too. And I was supposed to talk for about 15 minutes, and I spoke for 45 minutes. I couldn't figure out what happened. I was just carried away in 45 minutes. So I have chosen just basically 10 slides, and I promise you, I'm supposed to be done about 25 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. Okay, I'll try my best, because just to warn you, this is about 40 years of material that has accumulated. Okay, so that's my problem. Okay, democratization. Now, you can hear me, I guess, with the here too. In developing countries have taken two routes. Some of them have proceeded through reform. My main example is the country of South Korea that democratized in 1987 through student protests and the middle class joining them. And so they didn't have to remove the government or change the state power. The state power remained the same, but they moved to democracy, changed the constitution and became democratic. Then there were other countries in Asia, like the Philippines, Indonesia, Egypt. You can talk about Tunisia, many of these other countries, North Africa and Latin America. Some of them had to go through revolutionary movement and transformation to get to democracy. So the question of the book is that, which way is Iran going to go? Is Iran going to be successful like South Korea succeeded through reform? Or does Iran have to go through a revolution and disruption of the political, economic, and social structure to get to democracy? So the book analyzes a bunch of variables, basically 10 variables that compares South Korea, Indonesia, and Iran. And the conclusion is that it's highly unlikely for Iran to democratize through reform. And so instead, it is highly likely that Iran would have to go through a revolutionary transformation to achieve democracy. Okay. The first reason I say this is that I'm not going to go through all my variables, but I give you just a little bit of some of the things that have happened in Iran since the revolution so that you can figure out why I say that a revolution seems to be needed for Iran to democratize. The first failure of the Islamic regime, Islamic Republic, was in the political arena. Khomeini, during the revolutionary struggles from 1977 to 1979, when on February 11, the Shah was overthrown, Khomeini constantly promised, consistently, and the book documents that, oh yeah, we are for democracy, we are for freedom, our democracy is going to be better than Western democracy, things like that. Problem was that instead of granting freedom, once he seized power, he said that he wanted to establish an exclusive state, and he did. And he basically ended up, instead of democratizing the country, which in my understanding means empowering the civilian population against the state, he empowered the clergy, who became the rulers of the state and the country. And once opposition came in 1984, there was serious, intense opposition, particularly from the Islamic Mujahideen, who were socialists. And a lot of people were dying at the time. Khomeini made a statement that I found it very interesting, so I had to put it in the book in chapter 3. To protect Islam, to defend Muslims and Islam, you can lie, you can spy, and you can even drink alcohol. That was his statement. And of course, none of these are allowed in Islam. So most recently, now fast forward about 30 some years later, the Islamic clergy, as they lost their base of support after the Green Movement, a large number of them came out and said that the people have no role in the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. Legitimacy of the Islamic Republic is not dependent on the people. Rather, legitimacy came from God and the Prophet. So there's a problem here, because the Constitution of the Islamic Republic claims that people are sovereign. God has given people the sovereignty, and they are the ones that rule their own destiny, that determine their own destiny. Khomeini, a number of times before the revolution, even mentioned that every generation has to decide its own destiny. Previous generations made the wrong decision for us to have monarchy. We are going to overthrow it. And each generation has to decide. Now that they don't have any support, they say, well, people have no role in deciding what the government looks like. The second problem is the fact that the economic arena, the Islamic Republic failed completely. Khomeini consistently, again, during the revolution and in the years afterwards, until his death, he constantly promised that the Islamic Republic has come to reduce inequalities and serve the interests of the mustazafin, the downtrodden, the poor, the oppressed, and so forth. Now, at the time, people didn't know what was happening. So the Shah has left, and thousands of the Shah's associates had left the country. And so there was a lot of property, lots of wealth, lots of valuable assets. So Khomeini took over those and said, well, this belongs to the mustazafin, to the downtrodden, to the oppressed. And so this is going to be given to the poor and to the needy and so forth. So established a whole bunch of foundations that seized the assets of the royal family and all those that people used to call them during those days dependent capitalists, the capitalists who were in the modern sector and who were tied to the state and to the royal family. So this was a huge amount of assets. All of those came under the control of one man that is now called the supreme leader, was Ayatollah Khomeini then, and Ayatollah Khamenei now is the supreme leader. Now the issue with this is that it wasn't just those people, it was also religious minorities whom many of them have been persecuted, many of them were executed. And then all criminals, any criminal activity, the government expropriates the assets of criminals and gives them to the supreme leader. So in essence, the supreme leader alone has more assets than the Shah and the top echelon of Iranian society combined. That is stunning to see what religion does to a society and what clergy can do to its own people. Then came the Revolutionary Guard, particularly during the war against Iraq. They became powerful. They needed to have construction equipment and during the war because you need to attack Iraq. And so they became very good in engineering. And so finally they established their own corporations, and I called them Iran's first armed bourgeoisie. A few months ago, The Economist had an article, and the claim is that it's very hard to get to see how much assets they have. Their claim is that they control about 25% of Iran's GDP. But for the people, has been rising inequalities, unprecedented corruption, and cronyism. Usually, Iran has had problems with corruption for a long, long time. It got worsened during the Islamic regime. And one of the amazing things that happened, the universities those days during the monarchy, the Shah's period, were very clean and corruption didn't affect them, maybe with banks and the economic sectors and all that. Now you can go and buy degrees at any Iranian university. Some of these universities were some of the best universities in the world. In a couple of fields, they were some of the best and produced some of the great engineers and mathematicians. Actually, one of the Iranian mathematicians who studied in one high school in Tehran, still good. Saba, do you remember her name?
Yeah, Maryam
Mirzakhani. She won the first female award. She won the Fields Prize as the first woman to win the award in mathematics. Okay, Iran's per capita income declined. The highest per capita income that Iran ever achieved was 1976. This is about 3 years before the revolution. 1976, Iran's per capita income in $2005 was about $13,400, around that. By 2009, when the Green Movement was taking place, Iran's per capita was about $9,000. In $2005, the same dollar. So Iranians really lost very heavily as a result of the Islamic Revolution and all the corruption and the policies that the government pursued. Okay, Ahmadinejad is one of the recent victims of the Islamic Republic, I should say. During the post-election period after 2009 election, he kept saying that, oh, we reduced the Gini coefficient, the society is more equal. But then when you look at it, really, his statement doesn't make much sense because it was squeezing and destroying the middle class, that everybody became poor, and as a result, everybody became more equal. And so the Khamenei and his allies have got all the wealth, nobody else has anything, so everybody has become equal. By the way, since I talked about Ahmadinejad now is in the opposition. That's very strange to have Ahmadinejad in the opposition, because a few months before the election, which took place on last Friday, he decided to run. So he consulted the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said that I'm going to run. Khamenei said, no, you can't run. You shouldn't run because you will polarize again the population. And so all the clergy are very scared of polarizing Iran again because they know their fate is very, very precarious in Iran. And so they blocked him. But then several weeks later, the day that the registering to run was going to end, he showed up and he registered. I said, what? He's defying the supreme leader? You are not supposed to be doing it in the Islamic Republic. But of course, he was immediately rejected because the supreme leader has said, you can't run, so you're not qualified. So Iranians kept talking about, well, you got him elected in 2005 through fraud, and then you got him elected again in 2009, again through fraud. You killed about at least 112 people to say that he won. And you say his government was the cleanest government and his views were closer to you and everything. And now you say he's disqualified. What the hell is going on? And so everybody was wondering. Finally, I tried to read more and more from his statements and the kinds of thing going on. I realized that Ahmadinejad prefers to be in the opposition because that's where Iranian people are, opposition. He realized that being in the opposition, he would have greater like capacity and likelihood, chances of getting, again, running and getting elected. The third variable is that once they seized political power, and once they took all the economic assets and wealth of the country, they told the Iranian people, behave yourself. Your problem is cultural problem. We take the political power, and we take the economic power. You cover your hair and forget about makeup, don't drink, and all of these things, the kinds of dressing you have, all of these things should be banned and eliminated. So basically, the Islamic Republic ended up not producing any political and economic changes, which were the center of the demands for the revolution. Then instead, they gave them something that nobody was interested in. Nobody had said that, okay, my son has gone to the university, he became too secular and he drinks, he's alcoholic, and my daughter went to the university and studied at the university, and she took her headscarf and she's an atheist or what. Nobody made any claims that you have to do this, change the culture. There's not a single document that I could find that some of the clergy saying, well, culture is our problem. Everybody was talking about political freedom and greater economic equity. So they banned satellite dishes, and they made a whole bunch of changes that I put the music in there because Raisi, the conservative candidate who just lost, he went and took a picture with the musician. The music that the musician plays is not very popular in Iran. It's pop music, but not very popular. And so he wanted to become popular, that I like musicians and I like music. So the situation in Iran has changed so much that a conservative candidate has to go and take picture with a low musician, according to Rouhani. That's not my term. So Rouhani showed up this morning in a press conference. He said, now our opposition also like music. Things have changed a lot. And so, but he said, the kind of music they like, we Iranians don't like that kind of music anyway. So the situation has changed so much that conservative representatives are talking about music is good, music is not bad. Okay. Now, Iranians, of course, resisted the theocracy. And between 1981 and 1985, about 12,000 people lost their lives, either executed or lost their lives in armed struggle. In the summer of 1982, every morning we woke up, I was here in the United States, of course, woke up, 200 people executed, 150 executed. Every morning, 100, 150, 180, 200 people executed. It was very shocking, the kinds of things they were doing. And then in the summer of 1988, in about 2 months, 8 weeks, Ayatollah Khomeini ordered formation of what now in Iran is called Death Committee. And the Death Committee asked people, about 5,000 political prisoners, some of whose terms had actually ended. Do you believe in Islam, and do you believe in the principle of the rule of the jurisprudence? And do you believe in this thing? And if you said yes, so you won't be killed. If you said no, you got executed. And most of these people who were executed were actually Muslims. They were supporters of the Mujahideen, according to Amnesty International, and about 5,000 of them during those periods were executed. One of the reasons that Iranians mobilized at such high level, over about 74%, actually, it seems like, voted, the turnout. And the vast majority of them voted for Rouhani. One of the reasons they voted for Rouhani was that Mr. Raisi, Ayatollah Raisi, who was the opposition conservative candidate, he was one of the 3 members of the Death Committee that executed those people. And so just a month before the election, Ayatollah Montazeri, who is dead now, he was supposed to be Khomeini's successor. His son put his father's voice posted in the internet, and the father tells the 3 people, that you will be judged very badly in future for executing these people. And so people found out that Raisi was one of those Death Committee, and so he basically, as a result of it, made sure that Raisi won't get elected. Then after all these executions ended, the war ended, and in 1999, the first student protests showed up. Students in Iran have been always the universities, they call them bastion of freedom, and they have been the conscience of the people. And so for the first time, after universities were closed in 1980 for 2 years because of their opposition to the Islamic Republic, they came back. And one of the slogans of the protests, this was against censorship in the press, and they were shouting, "The people are miserable, the clerics are acting like gods." This, for the first time in Iranian history, you heard this kind of slogans. And then came 2009, the Green Movement, that attacked basically the foundation of the Islamic Republic, death to the dictator. And there were a lot of very interesting slogans that came out in Qom and Mashhad and Isfahan, all that. So the book documents a lot of these things that happened during those periods. So I don't have a lot to go, I promise you. Okay. Early on, Iranians also engaged in passive resistance. From very early on, they decided to not abide, to dissent against what Khomeini was calling for. The first thing was that about less than 3 months after the revolution, people started boycotting mosques, especially students began the opposition. And then they started not saying their prayers, which is obligatory in Islam. Right now, as we speak today, and Jean was in Iran just recently, he will talk about it. What is going on in Iran is that there are about 60,000 Shiite mosques in Iran. There are Sunnis too, but the vast majority of the mosques are Shiite mosques. And out of 60,000, about 30,000 do not even have clerics to run the mosque. And then out of 60,000, only 5% are operational year-round. Nobody pays khums or zakat, religious taxes. And so religion has been very much undermined. When it comes to prayer, in 2001, when there was a reformist government led by Khatami was in power, they did a poll, and this is also in the BBC broadcast, that 86% of the young students at the university did not say their obligatory prayer during the day, and 75% of the entire population did not say their Islamic prayers. And these are major changes that have taken place in Iran since the revolution. And so they basically undermined their own Islamic principles. So, but less than 4 months after the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini called on the young people, students and intellectuals, come back to the mosque. This is the bastion of the revolution, that people weren't coming back. Exactly a year later, it was an anniversary where Khomeini was talking about, exactly next year's anniversary, Khomeini said, these lewd ones, the lewd ones actually, it's in the book, the lewd ones have emptied the mosques in Iran. So it didn't take 10 years for people to stop going to the mosque and saying their prayers. Then there is, just before the Persian New Year, which is usually March 21st, they have this fire festival, which goes back to the time of the Zoroastrians, about close to probably 4,000 years ago. And the fire festival was celebrated when I was in Iran before 1970. Just few kids, occasionally high school kids, make a small bonfire and jump over it and sing songs that goes, traditional things that they have to say, and as they jump. But when the revolution came, Ayatollah Khomeini and the rest of the Ayatollahs said, well, this is really pagan, it's not Islamic, and people shouldn't do this. As soon as the Ayatollahs spoke, young Iranians, boys and girls, would celebrate this like no other. Every year since the revolution, people have died during the fire festival because accidents happen. The fires are so huge, so big, and they have firecrackers, explosives, and so forth. This year, not a large number died in Iran, but a few people still died as a result of this. And so they celebrate any moment they can get, and this fire festival is one of those. And many women have been refusing to observe the headscarf and the makeup. And in fact, what I found out, which is in the book in the first chapter, Iranian women use more mascara than Parisian women. And so it's just to fight against the Islamic Republic, they have those kind of things. Some girls, according to an Ayatollah whom I quote in the book, in Rome, he's stationed in Rome, he's a professor at the seminary, said that young women in Rome don't like to marry young clerics. And so this is very sad, and this is not Islamic. Women should realize that these young clerics are God's soldiers, and they don't deserve to be treated like that, so marry them. Okay. People have voted against conservative clergy, reducing their numbers in the parliament. This is one of the shocking things that I put in the book that I didn't know until just about a year ago when the new Majlis formed in the spring of 2016. When I looked at the numbers and then I went back to 1980 when the first parliament was convened. In 1980, there were 60.7% of the parliament were clerics. Clerics constituted about 60.7% of the parliament. And the 2016, the sitting parliament has only 5.5% clerics. That is a huge transformation in Iranian politics. For a state that claims to be a theocracy and being ruled by the clergy, this is what they ended up getting. And so you see the enthusiasm of people voting and getting rid of another cleric. Okay. Some secular activists recently summarized several months ago, it's in the book, summarized condition in Iran. We are a country that is socially injured and that in the past 3 decades has not been developing. We have become poor, addicted. We have been humiliated. We have lost our industry, agriculture, and all in all, we have lost everything. In bureaucratic corruption, number of executions, addiction, illiteracy, and unemployment, we have reached among the first in the world, but we have turned 2,000 to 3,000 ruling elite into super rich. We want democracy. For Iran, that is the rule of the people, for the people, and with the vote of the people. And I summarize it in my own conclusion. One of the conclusions in my book is that I say in sum, more than 3 decades after the formation of the Islamic Republic, Iranian society is more polarized than ever before. On the one hand, the regime insists on the continuation of the theocratic structures. On the other hand, people are engaged in widespread passive resistance and refuse to live in accordance with the rules of the theocracy. The persisting conflicts have compelled the regime to resort to endless repression. More importantly, the contradictions have generated irreconcilable conflicts and set the stage for protests and clashes that have yet to reach a climax. Thank you.
Dan is wrong on one thing. If Misagh were wearing a turban, he would look exactly like a mullah and not an Old Testament figure. And this is one thing I can't figure out about him. I want to thank Dan and the Takeyh Endowment for this opportunity to celebrate the publication of Misagh's latest book, Democracy in Iran, and it is well worth reading. I read most of it in manuscript form, and of course it's even better in its printed form. And this is a very important book, and it's equal to his Social Origins of the Iranian Revolution, which still provides the best understanding of the 1979 revolution, and which is a prequel to Democracy in Iran. Misagh, more than any other scholar of contemporary Iran, has based his critical analysis on the broadest range of sources and historical data. And there's every reason for the Times Literary Supplement reviewer to refer to the book as brilliant. It's not widely recognized that, and I'm going to do a variety of things here. I'm going to speak perhaps in broader terms, but in some instances more specifically, and relate this also to the broader Middle East, and by implication to the possibilities in terms of US policy, which we'll get to in the discussion section. But it's not widely recognized that the 1979 revolution and the eruption of the Iranian people after the 2009 fixed election of Ahmadinejad frightened and frightens autocratic Middle East rulers. The events of 1979 and of 2009 were yet other models for popular uprisings across the Middle East in 2011, 2012. This fear, plus Islamic Republic and Iran's assertion of its power in the region, accounts for the widely and mistakenly labeled Sunni-Shia conflict. That conflict has much more to do with geopolitics than with religion. 2009 also provides the essential starting point for democracy in Iran, when Iran's clerical regime could have responded to the Iranian people's call for even modest liberal political reforms, to rather brutally repress the demonstrators' calls for change and reform. Now, in Democracy in Iran, Misagh lays out 5 critical themes, at least from my perspective as an historian rather than as a sociologist. And this helps us to understand Iran's recent history, including last Friday's election. Yes, Rouhani won with 57% of the vote, with an overall turnout of more than 70, 73, 75% of Iranian voters. Imagine. Why is it that up to almost 80% of the Iranian population turned out to elect Khatami in 2001? And in his earlier election, first election to office in 1997, 70% turned out, which is still quite respectable. Why in our democracy did only 55% of eligible Americans vote last November? The moderates or reformers were equally successful over the principalists, as the hardliners are called, in last Friday's local city and village council elections. Given Iran is governed by an autocratic theocracy, such voter turnout raises two questions. Why do Iranians even bother to vote? And what is the likelihood of the anti-democratic Islamic State continuing? Now, going back to those 5 critical themes, they are, first of all, number 1, sovereignty. Does it derive from God or from the people? 2, and as a corollary to number 1, what is the nature of government? And 3, and this relates to both 1 and 2, the question of legitimacy. And the clerical regime, as Misagh has pointed out, is decidedly legitimacy deficient. 4, social economic factors, particularly the economic ones, and I'm not going to spend much time on that, and culture, particularly how Iranians relate to the West. Before examining these 5 themes, let me reveal, already has been revealed both by Dan and by Misagh, the ending of democracy in Iran. Reformers, all of the reformers, including those that are more moderate or are all part of a system that they have accepted and work within. Change will not come about through reform, but only through another revolution. Is that likely, even in the distant future, given that the Islamic Republican government doesn't shrink from brutal suppression? In addition, Iranians, including all Middle Eastern peoples, have seen the chaos and disorder across the region caused by the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, and more recently after the upheavals of 2011 and 2012 in the so-called Arab Spring. If anything, the peoples of the Middle East want stability and a sense of economic order. Now, sovereignty is the first of those themes, and here we need to go back to Iran's 1905-6 constitution. The nature of government enters in here as well. And I should note that this first constitution was based on the Belgian Constitution of 1831. Now, in that first constitution, sovereignty is God's alone. And in this world, that was expressed in the first Islamic centuries through the role played by the imams, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the 12th imam disappeared in the 9th century, and he's to return at the end of time. But pending his return, and through the 1905-6 Constitution, sovereignty is vested in the people. So this notion of the people's sovereignty goes back well over a century. In Shi'i political thought, the only legitimate government is that of the imams, but government, though flawed, is necessary. And I might add that clerics in Islamic history have never ruled directly until the revolution in 1979. In the case of Iran, parliamentary government with a constitutional monarch failed. First through the Qajar dynasty that was overthrown in what became known as the Pahlavi dynasty in 1921. The Pahlavis ruled until the 1979 revolution. They in turn manipulated the constitution and the parliament to cover their autocracy. I should add that they were far less ruthless than today's clerics. And if you have read Misagh's Social Origins, the key factors in the revolution were economic and political. Religion was not, and let me emphasize, not a primary factor. That's something else that's misunderstood in the West. The revolution went through two phases. First, the removal of the Shah, and then the hijacking of the revolution by the clerics that was institutionalized in the 1979 Constitution that summer. Why even a constitution? That idea is not to be found within the Islamic tradition, and clerics emphasize this whole idea of finding precedent in the Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet. And the answer is that despite the failures of the 1905-06 Constitution, the Iranian people valued its principles, especially their role in it and its checks and balances. However, the 1979 Constitution of the Islamic Republic replicated the essential contradiction regarding sovereignty. It has the same contradictions that the 05-06 Constitution has in terms of sovereignty belonging to God, but also coming from the people. How do you resolve that? But in the 1979 Constitution, one difference in this regard was that authority was not invested in the people, although they were recognized as being an element of it. Furthermore, the monarch was replaced by the office initially of the Vilayat Faqih, a guardianship of the most learned Shi'i jurist, and after Khomeini, the title was effectively changed to Rahbar, which means leader or the supreme leader, simply because Khomeini lacked the necessary religious qualifications to be the Vilayat Faqih. Those clerics qualified to be the Vilayat Faqih, and Montazeri was mentioned by Misagh. It was supposed to have been the successor. Those clerics qualified rejected the notion that clerics should be involved in government, let alone lead one. And today, the highest ranking Shi'i cleric is Sistani in Iraq, and he's one of those that rejects this whole notion of clerical rule. Clerical rule, and the reason why the hijacking was successful, was solidified by Saddam Hussein's invasion and then the long Iran-Iraq war that lasted from 1980 to 1988, and Khomeini dies in 89. But it was also solidified by the hostage crisis and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. All of these within Iran were seen as a threat to undo the revolution, and certainly in the case of the hostage crisis, to reinstall the Shah as ruler. While a theocracy was empowered and has been intent on maintaining its absolute power through the leader and related institutions, a role was allotted to the people in several instances, particularly in electing the president, whose powers are delineated if greatly restricted. Importantly, the leader is the commander of chief and controls all instruments of coercion, including not only the military forces, the regular military forces, but most importantly, the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij. The Revolutionary Guard now has widespread economic roles that Misagh pointed out and has its own self-interest. And the Basij play a role in promoting public morality and supporting the regime. The Islamic Republic is not only a theocracy, but a police state, whose economy is dominated by clerics and the Revolutionary Guard. Let me turn to the third theme then that I want to develop briefly, and that is this question of legitimacy. The Pahlavis derived legitimacy from the 1905-6 Constitution, despite their manipulation of it. Iranian nationalism based on Iranian rather than Islamic history, and this is very, very important, although that too was part of it, and modernization that included centralization of power, new institutions, including westernized ones, and the reassertion of Iranian hegemony in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf area. The Pahlavis lost legitimacy through their manipulation of the Constitution, notions of their own grandeur, repression, although nothing on the scale of the Islamic Republic, mismanagement of policies, and overemphasis on militarization at the expense of other needs. Khomeini derived his legitimacy through religion. He was a ranking Shi'i cleric. His role in and the revolution itself, the Iran-Iraq War. These were the critical factors in his legitimacy. Khomeini's legitimacy was seen in his role by some as Khomeini's successor, but not as a leading cleric. He was a mid-ranking cleric in his parliament, again breaking with historical precedent that elected him as Vilayat-e Faqih, a title that he had not earned, or a position that he had not earned in a traditional way. Religion for Khomeini is a factor in his legitimacy in the eyes of maybe a quarter of Iran's population. He also gains legitimacy through a number of policies, such as direct and indirect subsidies for those who are less well off, which is a political football, and was in last Friday's election as well. One positive policy has been the expansion in education, including higher education for women, where 60% of university students are now women. While Khomeini too uses the rhetoric of the revolution, he has lost legitimacy through mismanagement of the economy, rampant corruption, suppression and brutality, isolation of Iran within the world, and the government's intrusion into private space and restrictive control of public morality. Religion has been way overemphasized in the West as Iranians have become increasingly cynical about it. And Misagh mentioned that I was recently in Iran, and before going to Iran, we spent several days in Istanbul where all of the mosques were full of worshipers. You arrive in Iran, they're all empty. That was one of the biggest shocks. And let's just touch briefly on that's my fourth theme of the social economic factors, which Misagh presented so clearly. Again, there's the factors of mismanagement, corruption, isolation as a result of US-led sanctions over issues such as nuclear development and Iran's support for Hezbollah and Assad of Syria. There are the demographic factors such as a very youthful population. What is it? Half the population is under 35. Very high unemployment, especially with that group, including university graduates. The factor of urbanization, inflation, the fall in oil prices. Iran has undergone extraordinary change. And one of the great shocks, when I first went to Iran, well over 50 years ago, the population of Tehran was 1.5 million. Today it's around 14 million. I mean, Tehran, the population has increased that much. And when you arrive there, you're struck by all of the cranes building high-rise buildings in Tehran, but then you realize they're all immobile. And that was a result of the sanctions and the problem of credits. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why Rouhani negotiated the nuclear accord, was to start the process of bringing those sanctions to an end. The nuclear accord has been hugely popular in Iran, even though the lifting of some sanctions has not met promised expectations. Culture, the last of my 5 themes. And central here is how Iranians relate to modernization, particularly Westernization. When Westernization by the regime is cast in the form of the great Satan and necessitates enforcement of a restrictive public and private morality, human rights and rule of law figure in this cultural theme as well. Let's leave it at that and turn briefly to the elections. Interestingly, and unlike last week, the results seem almost anticlimactic. Just remember the sort of the energy and the excitement, even by people who were not well informed in Iran last week, and today, it's happened. Rouhani, the moderate, won. Raisi, the hardliner, decisively lost. Urban versus rural, globalists versus nationalist localizers, young versus old, middle class versus poor, secular versus religious. You can set up all kinds of binaries in that election. The differences are all there. But how much change can Rouhani actually affect, given that power is essentially in the hands of Khomeini and the clerical establishment? He, by the way, of course, is a cleric himself. Can he meet the expectations of those who voted for him? The necessary economic changes are going to be difficult to implement. Iran's place in the world, including the loosening of sanctions and the role of the United States, will require backing off from positions staked out by Iran's hardliners, particularly the Revolutionary Guard. Before concluding, let's go back to the question as to why Iranians bothered to vote at all, given the obstacles to the political, economic, and cultural changes that they demand. The higher voter turnout is used by Khomeini to trumpet the regime's legitimacy. The 2 candidates did present 2 different possible futures, and were voters simply choosing the lesser of 2 evils. And the Iranian people had lived through the differences between a Khatami, who was a moderate, and an Ahmadinejad, who was a hardliner. I would argue that Iranian voters used the ballot to assert their sovereignty in the face of an autocratic system, and to challenge Khomeini and to reinforce the leader's sense of the regime's insecurity, its illegitimacy. One forthcoming and related crisis that needs mentioning could well be the issue of succession following Khomeini's death, and he's in poor health. But his successor is apt to be someone who is equally a hardliner, and that controlling group seems ever more determined to resist change, reform, or to open up. This emphasizes Misagh's conclusion in Democracy in Iran that only through revolution will Iranians achieve the liberal democracy for which they have been seeking for well over a century. Thanks.
Okay, want to sit there? So a few questions about a few exchanges, perhaps about the election, and then we can throw it open for questions. So I guess question number 1 for either of you: why didn't the clerical establishment stuff the ballot boxes?
I'm sorry.
Why did they not? Why didn't they not falsify the election outcomes as they've done before?
Very good question. Iranians have been telling me, Iranians who live over there, not the ones here, have been telling me, they always try to stuff the ballots. They always try that. And the problem is that when the voter turnout is very high, it becomes almost impossible. And so the second problem associated with it, even if they do it, if the turnout is very high, they're not going to succeed anyway. And then what happens right after the election, what happened in 2009, there were protests. And the protests, as a result of the protests, Ayatollah Khamenei said, and it's in the book, that they brought the green movement, the green protests, he calls them sedition, brought the Islamic Republic to the edge of the cliff. And a number of other Ayatollahs also made similar remarks. The leaders of the Revolutionary Guard said that the 2 years of green movement was harder to defeat than the 8 years war against Iran and Iraq. They were paralyzed in part because they had lost a support of a big portion of the Revolutionary Guard, and they couldn't use the Revolutionary Guard. They had to bring the Basij that Jean mentioned. And the Basij are these paramilitary forces that are given money, and they come and beat up people. And it was through them. And the commander of the Revolutionary Guard said in chapter 8, I quote him, that without the Basij, we don't know what might have happened to the Islamic Republic. So that's the fear. They stuff the ballot, what might happen next, the protests and the conflicts.
So that's really interesting, and your remark about the Revolutionary Guard raises another question. You used in your talk the phrase "an armed bourgeoisie." Well, bourgeoisies often become the agents of change, and we don't think of the IRGC as being sort of in a pre-revolutionary state, but maybe you know something that we don't. What do you think? I mean, is this a crowd that ultimately is looking for more predictability, open markets, things like that? That's not really the standard explanation of the IRGC today.
No, very good point again. They are not the regular bourgeoisie, and so they are very much attached to the clerical rule and clerical leadership and all that. I only made the statement about the bourgeoisie in a mocking fashion. This bourgeoisie is not the bourgeoisie. I agree with you, the bourgeoisie is agent of change, which brought democracy and development to the Western world and all that. That's not what I mean by it. But in the sense that they are just rapacious.
Yep.
And they win all the contracts. And sometimes one of the things I talk about in the book is that they got all the money for a contract in the Persian Gulf in Kish. And they got all the money. They did about 2% of the votes and told the Rouhani government, this is all we can do. And that was it. The Rouhani's representative said, and it's in the book, that their power is more greater than ours and we can't do anything about it. We gave them all the money and this is what they did and we can do nothing. And so it's just very arbitrary, it's corrupt, and it's just through force and arresting people. And they intervene in every election. After the 2005 elections, when Ahmadinejad won, according to Rafsanjani, who was quoted by Ali Mutahari, who is a conservative member of the current parliament, he said that 123 of them were summoned to the court, they were put on trial, and they were convicted. And then Rafsanjani, according to Mutahari, quoting Rafsanjani, said, well, we didn't want to damage the prestige and the standing of the Islamic Republic, so we let them go. That's what happens. They intervene in politics, they intervene in the economy, they don't do anything. And so this bourgeoisie is not the kind of bourgeoisie that we saw in the West. The other thing I have noticed is that one of the reasons that I think revolution is needed is the fact that Indonesia is another Islamic country. They had similar thing. The Indonesian military participated in economic activities. They owned a lot of state enterprises. During the Shah, we didn't have any of it. The government owned state enterprises, but not the army, not the military. The other two countries that I've noticed had, one was Indonesia, the other one was Egypt. Both of them had to go through revolution to pretend to come to democracy. Indonesia has fairly succeeded. Egypt, it succeeded a little bit and then it was overturned again because the military controlled so much wealth and economic assets. You can't tell them that you shouldn't do this, because once they have a lot of economic assets, they maintain some autonomy vis-a-vis the population, but also the state. And so, well, we are the rulers. We have the money, we have the resources, we do what we want. And so as a result of that, where the military becomes very active in the economic arena, you end up having to have, one of the reasons that it's having to have a revolution, because you can't control them unless overthrow them and get rid of them.
Let me simply add, to emphasize this, is that the Revolutionary Guard is interested only in itself. But this is true across the Middle East, and not just in Egypt, is that all of the militaries now, and this was a problem in Turkey too, that all of the militaries play this very important economic role, since the military represents such a major part of the economy.
So, Misagh, I have a question. If you believe that it's going to take a revolution to change Iran, you're the President of the United States. Is your interest in heightening the contradictions, as Lenin would say, or in essentially trying to chart a course between Sunni and Shia and create essentially a way for Iran to emerge from its isolation without giving the Iranians any passes on terrorism, subversion, and all the other tricks that they've historically been up to in the region?
Yeah, I think you were in national media last night, and you spoke about Shia Sunni.
Yeah.
I think that's a bad tactic. That's not going to work. That's not what the Iranians want.
So you're agreeing with what I said last night?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I agree with
All
you.
right. That's
But-
important.
But so the problem is that the previous sanctions from the United Nations, the US, United Nations, 5+1, that was very extremely effective in undermining the regime, but it also undermined the people. And one of the reasons people voted for Rouhani was to avoid sanctions and another war that Trump might be threatening, might be trying to bring about. And that worked so adversely for the population of Iran that they want to avoid that at any cost. But you're right, if Trump goes in that direction, it presents what Lenin said, intensifying the contradictions and the conflicts. They have done a very good job. That's why so many people went and participated in the elections, just to avoid that kind of an outcome.
If you want to bring about legitimacy for the Islamic Republican government,
Keep driving them into a corner.
exactly, and the United States cannot bring about regime change there that would be legitimate.
Right.
And the change in Iran has to come from within and not from outside.
So years ago, it used to be true that polling showed that Iran was, outside of perhaps Israel, the most pro-American country in the broader Middle East. Is that still the case?
Oh, yes. Yeah. When I was there, everybody that we talked with, from school children to old people, they were all delighted that we were there. Partly because they wanted to practice their English, but they were also surprised that we were there. But they all expressed how important the United States was to them. And I think Trump belittles soft power, but in the case of Iran, most everybody, including lots of the clerics, have a real respect for the United States. Where do the clerics' children go to college and university? The United States. This, by the way, is the review article from TLS, the Times Literary Supplement. And I'll pass this around, but I want it back. And what you see here is a young woman wearing blue jeans, and you'll notice that her knee is exposed, that her scarf is way back on her head. She's in a mall buying or looking at very, very expensive shoes. One of the other things that struck us when we were in Iran was the fact that provincial towns are no different from Tehran in terms of how young people dress and act. And their model is not just Western, but it's American.
So, Gene, can I add one more thing to what you're saying?
Yeah.
So one of the things that happened after the Green Movement was in September 2009, and there was a government-sponsored march in favor of Quds, which is Jerusalem, in favor of Palestinians taking over the Quds and all that. And so the loudspeaker, and this is available in YouTube, and I cited it in the book, the loudspeaker says, few slogans and people shout, and then he says, "Death to America." And so the marchers are supposed to be shouting death to America. They said, "Death to Russia." And they says, "Death to Israel." Mark bar Israel. Say, "Death to China." And I kept listening. I thought there should be one voice or two voices to say death to America, Mark bar America, or death to Israel. Nobody. And that's the extent what Gene is talking about. Even within the Green Movement, they were supporting the United States and Israel instead of Russia and China. Because Russia and China are allies of the Islamic Republic in economic terms. Their trade and all that, those kind of things.
Well,
But that can change too very quickly. Before 2003, the Turkish approval of the United States was 83% or something like that. After the invasion of Iraq, in Turkey, it dropped to, I think it was 9%.
that was very, very low,
Yeah.
extraordinarily low. So there are a million other questions to ask. I want to open up to the audience, but I can't resist one last question. Do you have any triggers that you think are particularly important for the revolution?
Triggers is not going to come, shouldn't come from Washington, D.C., as Gene mentioned. Every time there was the hostage crisis, there was the Iraq War, every time there is an external conflict, Iranians tend to unite. And this is what should not happen. Do not unite this population. Let the contradictions and heighten and end up. Right now, this is what I just saw. I wrote it here in Persian. The Ayatollah who is in Mashhad, the conservative one who is father-in-law of the opposition that lost, he said, the threat to the revolution, to the Islamic Republic, and to the supreme leader are the Iranian people, elections, and democracy. He spoke today, and I just saw it in the internet, and this is what is happening in Iran. So Mr. Trump should listen to what's going on over there and not provoke another war.
Yeah, he's not known for taking good briefings, but why don't we move right along, Professor Haynes?
Yeah, well, I know from our discussions in the past that the role of the military in these revolutions was very important. Either the military is split factionally so strongly that it doesn't act, or it might actually side with the revolutionaries. In many cases, that's what's happened in the Philippines. So could you say a little bit about the possibility of fissures in the military in Iran? It would seem to me that that would be critical to any revolution that was happening. Are there any signs of that at all?
Great question. Yes, very good question. And the signs, which we didn't know very much about, came as a result of statements that came right after the 2009 elections and protests. So the rank and file of the Revolutionary Guard wasn't willing to shoot the people. The army is mostly conscript. Now, recently, a lot of the rank and file in the Revolutionary Guard are also conscript. Had they had brought the conscripts out, the conscripts would have shot the leaders, commanders of the Revolutionary Guard rather than the people. This happened during the Shah, as you mentioned before, and then it resulted in the revolution. Yes, so there are good signs that the army is split, the leadership and the rank and file. The Revolutionary Guard is less split probably from the army compared to the army, but still it is so split that they would not be able, another conflict, they would not be able to control the population. Just a few days ago, the head of the intelligence part of the Revolutionary Guard said, and I heard it in the internet, the voice was there, the picture actually was there too, wasn't very clear. He said that we have to make sure, do everything to prevent people from coming to the streets. Make sure that the election is smooth, because if they come out and they protest minute by minute, they will expand, they will take over the whole country, and we're the loser, and we don't know where to go after that. That's what the head of the intelligence part of the revolution got. So there are good signs that it might happen. If there are protests and conflict, the army might split, may not be able to come out. The Revolutionary Guard, we saw that already split. So there are good signs that that might happen.
We may have to put you in a sealed train and send you there.
Not Lenin.
I want to thank you for a brilliant presentation, really impressive, but it has a hallucinating parallel with what I've been studying, which is between 1499 and 1517, exactly the same kind of thing happened in Italy that led to modernity. 1499 is Amerigo comes back from discovering the New World. And that meant a lot of things, including that the traditional Catholic religious interpretation that Christ came to save all men was simply wrong. And that had a big effect. And 1517 is when the revolution really starts with two events: Luther posting, and something else, Machiavelli writing a book called The Prince. Terrific presentation, but also I think it gets at a logic why your prediction of revolution is exactly right.
Thank you.
Just picking up on your last point, I've read that the difference between 79 and now is that the Shah's administration was all American educated and left and went to California, whereas the administration, the Guard, has no place to go and is going to dig in and make it very bloody. Do you subscribe to that at all?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part. The Shah's government had...
The Shah's, the people working for the Shah were all American educated, and they got up and left the country, whereas the Guard has nowhere to go. And so the fight would be much more bloody, much more intractable. Do you subscribe to that?
Yeah, very good question. This is what the Iranians are trying to avoid, because they know that with the Islamic Republic, the thousands that were executed and killed in the early part, they know that these guys kill. And now every time, okay, let me just say Rouhani, who was just re-elected. Rouhani in 1999, when the students were protesting, this Mr. Rouhani was the head of a council, something like National Security Council. At the time, he was the head of that council, and he said, arrest these lowly people, the students, who were protesting against censorship. Arrest them, put them on trial, and sentence them to what they deserve as muhareb. Muhareb means people who have enmity against God, warring against God. In Islamic Republic, it means death, execution. That's what it means. So Iranians know that these people are very ruthless, and they are willing to kill thousands again if they can do it. So it can become very violent if everything gets out of control. But both sides have so far have been cautious, not getting that far. The regime is very afraid of people protesting. A memo came several weeks ago, a few months ago, that said, tell the managers and executives in corporations and government enterprises that make sure that workers do not go on strike during the elections, a little bit before and a little bit after the elections, because we don't want to provide any excuses for the enemy to do anything. And there are other things people have said, that make sure to keep the calm of the people. And Khamenei has said many times. So it could get out of hand and it could become very violent. But the two sides already know it, that this side can be very violent and ruthless, and the population is trying to avoid paying a cost. They're very happy, and you see them they have been very happy past few days. But I don't think they realize that what they have wanted from, as Jean mentioned, from 1905, 1906 revolution, which has been democracy, was one of the first countries in Asia that started fighting for democracy. They still are fighting. And they don't realize, if my argument is right, they have to, in the end, they have to resort to some kind of disruptive action that can get rid of the rascals. and they're hoping that they don't have to go there, but it's going to be inevitable. Because one of the things President Kennedy said, those who resist, who try to prevent peaceful change, will make violent change inevitable. And that's what these guys are going to be doing, unfortunately.
So a quick question, do you expect the death of the supreme leader to be the most likely trigger, that's when everything will break loose?
Very good point. That's another issue. One of the reasons that people participated heavily in the election against Raisi, the opposition guy, was that this guy is already, his name is mentioned as the successor to Khamenei. So they wanted to block that. And so, but once that happens, whoever comes, so Raisi is eliminated. Now, the position of Rouhani is somewhat pushed up a little bit because he got popularity. The problem is that the conservatives who dominate the assembly of experts that picks the supreme leader are all pretty much conservative. The only one that was a little bit moderate, who was also sort of a little bit pushed aside by the conservatives, was Ayatollah Rafsanjani. The rumor is that Rafsanjani was actually murdered to block him, to support Rouhani in case Rouhani gets re-elected, and that way they can push Raisi. So Raisi is now eliminated. There's Shahrudi and a couple of other people, but the other name that is now being mentioned, has been mentioned for a while, is Khamenei's own son. His name is Mujtaba, and one of the slogans of 2009 protests was that Mujtaba, bemiri, bemiri, rahbari ro nabini. Persians, everything has to be poetic. Yeah. It rhymes. And so Mujtaba, we hope, it's in the book, chapter 8 again. Mujtaba, we hope you die and not see the leadership.
Well, that's very eloquent.
Despite the talk about, is this on?
Yes.
Despite the talk about conflict and within the country and changing the leadership, your final paragraph talks about the passivity of the people. And I sort of get the impression when I see articles, newspaper articles with blue jeans and quite westernized style and spending money on expensive things and sending children to America to educate them. Are the people really going to drive that kind of change? Aren't they happy as long as they're economically sound?
No. Thank you for mentioning that. Let me clarify what I mean here. By passive resistance, I don't mean passivity in that sense. Passive resistance, I'm talking about Gandhi and the resistance in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. That means non-cooperation. That's the sense I'm using it. I appreciate you bringing it up. So passive resistance are things like 80% of high school girls have boyfriends in Iran. Kids in elementary school, this is the official statements I'm mentioning. Everything is documented in my book, in this new book, but also mentioned in their own media, okay? And so kids who in elementary school come drunk. Kids come drunk to school. And they have these white marriages as men and women living together without getting married. Makes the clergy very angry. These are like instances of resistance against the Islamic Republic and against the social and religious norms that they have imposed. There are a lot of them. Women pushing the scarf, and Jean had showed the picture, as far as they can. I saw a video 3-4 weeks ago. A woman, Iranian woman, Ahmadinejad was in a press conference, Iranian woman who had pushed the scarf to the back. I had to call my wife, since my glasses need to change. I said, do you see a scarf? And she noticed it was way in the back there. Mm-hmm. And she asked me, she said, well, you said that you weren't going to run, and now you registered. Did you lie to us? And a woman. Now, the thing is that Iranian women are now more courageous than men. They fight at every level, at every moment, every opportunity they get, they fight. That's what is going on. In the city of Shahmirzad, not a very large city, I've been there before, two teenagers are walking in the street, and there's a mullah, Friday prayer leader sees them. One of them, the hair is showing, actually both of them, and one of them was way back. He said to her, "Fix your scarf." And she said, "Shut your eyes." And so he started bad-mouthing her, and they punched him. He ended up in the hospital, surgery. Things like this happen in Iran, and it's a large scale. That's what I call passive resistance. In this case, there was a little bit active punching, but that's what is going on. They know they're isolated. They know what has happened. But this is what happens when the population did not ask for an Islamic theocracy. Ayatollah Khomeini never spoke about the principle of theocracy, that the jurist, as Jin mentioned, would rule this country. That wasn't a part of the deal. And he had talked about it in his lectures in Najaf while he was in exile. Iranians, all they got, the tapes and the leaflets and the statements came from him, is all for freedom and democracy and such things. Suddenly they say, what's this supposed to be? And the intellectuals had no clue what it was. And so once the theocracy is imposed and those cultural changes, this is not what people wanted. So they're going to resist. And the passive resistance actually began day one, after Khomeini came back. And so now it has become so widespread that they really have no way controlling it. After in 2010, this came from the New York Times, has a reporter in Tehran, a Dutch guy who is married to an Iranian, so they can't kick him out easily because he has a wife who is Iranian. He said, women were given fines of $800 for not wearing proper hijab. $800 for a university student who doesn't have a job. $800 at that time is a lot of money for a single woman who is pushing the scarf. And they were paying this. And they were being arrested and given fine, some of them jailed and tortured, but they're fighting back. And that's just the last point on this. A member of parliament who escaped Iran, she was in jail for a couple of days. She lives in Boston now. So I met with her a few times and interviewed her. She said that when she was in the parliament, she stood up and spoke about a large number of issues. And then one day she said, a whole bunch of parliamentarians got together, and one of them said, well, I found who the man is in this parliament. And the only man is this, Fatemeh is her name, is Fatemeh, who is actually not a man, is a woman. She's the only man in this parliament, and they all laughed. They all agreed that women are now the men of the country, meaning they are the courageous ones.
So we need to bring it to an end, but you have been waiting patiently, so you get the last question.
Yeah, so first of all, I really enjoyed the presentation, so thank you. Also, my question was directed to Professor Garthwaite. You spoke a little bit about how the nature of the relationship between Iran and its neighboring countries is not so much based in the Shia-Sunni divide, but more so in geopolitics. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I brought the map for a reason, hoping or thinking that question might come up. Iran, you can see from the map, is a large country. And Misagh mentioned that its population is the second largest in the entire Middle East. Historically, it's been the hegemon of this region. It has its own national interests in terms of the region. And they're interested, for example, in having a stable Iraq, as well as a stable Afghanistan, because they're the immediate neighbors, just as we're interested in having a stable Mexico and believe it or not, Canada. And in one instance, though, the southern half of Iraq has a Shi'i population, and Shiism is important, of course, in Iraq, but also in Iran. So there's this commonality as well. And in both of these cases, they share a national interest with the United States. Sorry, Dan, I'm getting into your area. So that's a shared interest with the United States. The support they provide for Syria has nothing to do with Shiism. In fact, the Iranian religious establishment doesn't regard the Alawites who control Syria as being Muslim, even though it's an offshoot, a very ancient offshoot of Shiism. The support for Syria comes because Assad's father supported the United States, or excuse me, supported Iran in the Iran-Iraq War. The support for Hezbollah in Lebanon in particular is an attempt on the part of the Iranians to play an expanded hegemonic role in the Middle East, and they represent themselves with some success as the defenders of the Palestinians. And they argue that the Arabs themselves have sort of neglected and set the Palestinians adrift. Iran, another Shi'i country is Bahrain, where 60% of the population is Shia. And they're charged with interfering in Bahrain, but in fact they're not. It's Saudi Arabia that is propping up the ruling family in Bahrain, which is Sunni, and represses the Shi'i population there. But the Saudis' concern about Shiism has to do with the fact that here in the eastern provinces where the oil fields are located, are influenced by developments in Iran, but also in Bahrain. And the Saudis are fearful then that the Shia will somehow rise up against them because they're discriminated against by the Saudis, the Wahhabis. So that the Saudis use the Sunni Shi'i thing as do other Sunni states as for internal political reasons. And it's difficult to, and you see under the Shah, under Nixon, with the Nixon doctrine, the two pillars of support for U.S. policy in this region were Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iran and Saudi Arabia have cooperated in the past. And now, right now, they're at odds with each other. And the Saudis are hoping then to use the new Trump administration to sort of fight their battles with them against Iran. I don't know if it answers your questions or not.
I think that's a good place to stop, although I would add one small textual emendation. They want us to fight their battles for them.
For them, right,
Okay.
right, exactly.
Well, I want to thank Professor Parsa for writing a great book, giving a great presentation, and giving us an opportunity to have a terrific discussion. So I hope you'll join me in thanking him.
Thank you.